Back on the record, this is the people of the state of Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12 CR 1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. Would counsel please approach Mr. Bruckler and Ms. Brady? Are the parties ready for the jury, Mr. Bruckler?
Yes, sir, we are.
Ms. Brady? All right. Before I bring the jury in, I want to address the spectators in the courtroom. This is a public trial, and I want everyone to feel welcome and comfortable here. That is very important to me. However, you must observe proper courtroom decorum. I am sensitive to the fact that this case may evoke powerful emotions. I fully understand that. For that reason, I have not prohibited emotional reactions. To the contrary, in Order D-79, I recognized that some visible emotional reactions are inevitable and appropriate. What I have prohibited are audible comments and emotional outbursts that may improperly influence the jury. If at any time you feel the onset of an emotional outburst, please quietly and discreetly exit the courtroom. You may return to the courtroom when you're ready to do so in compliance with my order. For the most part, so far in this trial, there have been no issues from anyone in the gallery. I thank you for that, and I ask that you please continue to conduct yourself. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom, minus juror number 661. Folks, I have allowed her to watch the proceedings from another courtroom. She asked if she could do that so as not to disrupt the proceedings with her cough. So I've given her the chance to do that, and so that's what's happening, all right? Okay, with that, as you know, members of the jury, the next step in the proceedings are closing arguments. The prosecution goes first. Mr. Brockler, are you ready for the prosecution's closing argument?
Yes, sir.
You may proceed.
Through this door is horror. Through this door are bullets, blood, brains, and bodies. Through this door, after more than 2.5 months of complex, detailed planning, he came in to murder everyone and was successful in killing 12. You have been here for 15 weeks, 60 days of trial, 2,695 separate pieces of evidence, 306 witnesses, including 34 to tell you about every aspect of his life, and 13 to give you a glimpse of the 12 lives he took. All of that leading to right now to determine what is the appropriate sentence for such horror, such evil.
I'm going to object to the characterization of evil.
You have deliberated 3 times. You have found unanimously, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he knew right from wrong, that he could form the intent to murder and deliberate on that murder. And you found that he murdered one, and right there with that one murder, the sentence is life imprisonment without parole. But you found more than that. You found that he'd murdered 3, 6, 10, 12 men, women, and a child. But you did more. The second time you deliberated, you found that in addition to killing more than 2 people in a single criminal episode, you found that he did it by virtue of ambush. And you found that beyond a reasonable doubt unanimously. You also found that his manner of murdering these 12 people was cruel and torturous. And you found that unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt. You also found that in murdering these 12 people by ambush, cruelly and torturously, that he created a grave risk of death to all those others around those that he murdered. And you found that unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt. But you did more than that. You also listened to those 34 witnesses to give you every possible justification to impose the same sentence as an unaggravated murder of one. But unanimously, beyond a reasonable doubt, you found that the aggravation still outweighed all that. And then we had the last 2 days where you got to learn about the ramifications of his conduct far beyond the pictures that we'd seen, far beyond those who testified about the ones that they'd lost inside the theater. And so the question remains, what is the appropriate sentence for such horror, for such evil?
Object again to the characterization of evil.
Would counsel please approach for a moment? All right, the objection is overruled. Mr. Bruckler, you may proceed as we discussed.
Thank you, sir. So the question remains, what is the appropriate sentence for such conduct? Is it that life sentence that goes to the unaggravated murder of one, or is it something more? You have considered so much. You have deliberated so much and found so much, it is difficult to stand here and think of how the words of attorneys can add anything to this process at this point. It is difficult to imagine what words could be spoken to you, what arguments could be advanced that would make a life sentence the appropriate sentence for what has happened here.
Judge, I'm going to object to that. That's for the jury to decide.
Overruled. The jury understands. It is the jury's decision. Go ahead, Mr. Brackler.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can words be spoken to you in a passionate way that would justify a life sentence? To find a life sentence, if there were tears, if there were pleading, could that make a life sentence appropriate for what he has done? Could someone argue to you mercy, mercy, that mercy is about the giver, not the receiver? Could they play upon your conscience and your guilt and make a life sentence appropriate for what he's done? About emotion. Would emotion do it? The time for emotion, that time for tears, that time for passion, that is yesterday. This is about justice. And when the judge tells you to use your individual reasoned moral judgment, just like we discussed in jury selection, this is about justice. Could someone tell you that a decision to impose a death sentence for this horror, that is only out of vengeance, or that it is an act of revenge on behalf of the victims? No. You know better than that. This building that we're in is not the Arapahoe County Eye for an Eye Center, or Revenge Center, or Vengeance Center. It is a justice center. And that is what you use to determine what the appropriate sentence for what he did is. Could a quote from someone, could attacking the motives of the prosecution or of me, could these things justify imposing the same sentence for an unaggravated murder of one for what he did? No. There are few words I can give you to tell you more than you know already. You are experts in the facts. You are experts in a way, in mental health. And could that justify it now? Another mental illness argument? Having found beyond a reasonable doubt unanimously that he knew right from wrong, could intend and deliberate to murder, could conform his conduct to society's norms, and all the things that you know that he did, considered in planning for this murder. Could that now justify that life sentence?
I'm going to object that the implication that their prior decisions somehow dictate what they should do now. That's contrary to the court's instruction.
The objection is overruled, but the jury heard my instruction that your prior decisions do not dictate your decision here in the last phase of the sentencing hearing. Everybody understand that, right? And people are nodding their head yes. All right, you may proceed.
Yeah, I've said this to you before, but listen, don't ever go by what I tell you the law is. These are attorney words meant to try to couch for you terms about this evidence and this process, but always go with the law that the judge gives you, not the attorneys. One of the things that you now get to consider that you didn't have at guilt, that you didn't have at phase 1, and that you didn't have at phase 2, in assessing the moral culpability for the crimes that he committed, are those victims, are the deceased. The ones from here. And no matter what can be said about any other piece of evidence, this is true. They did not pick him. He picked them. He picked the time, place, and manner of their deaths. And does he get a life sentence for that? When you look back on the last 2 days as you consider his moral culpability, what will you remember? What will stick out to you in your mind about Alex Sullivan? Is it that it was his birthday when he died? Is it the relationship that he had with his father? Is it that he was that guy that jumped up in the row and yelled out for the Superman trailer? Or is it War Eagle? A.J. Boyk, 18. What will you remember about A.J. Boyk? Is it that this photo was taken in the moments before he shot him to death? Is it the young love? Is it the fact that this skateboarding catcher was into ceramics and the viola, and his life was ended right there in that seat by him? How about Jessica Gowie? Is it the future that was taken from her? A pretty young woman who wanted to be a hockey announcer from San Antonio. Is that it? Or is it Sandy Phillips? Will that be what you remember most about the person he murdered named Jessica Gowie? Gordon Cowden. At the movies with his 2 daughters. He doted on them. Sierra sat here and courageously tried to tell us about the impact of him and his loss on her life. What will you remember about Gordon? He wasn't the only parent, though, in that theater that night. How about Rebecca Wingo? The mother of those two young girls who happened to be out away on an adult night to see a movie when she died right there where she sat. Maybe it's Jonathan Blunk. Will you remember that Jonathan Blunk was the father of 2 and that he wanted them to be courageous and strong? Or will you remember that he died trying to protect the person sitting next to him when he shot him in the head? Alexander Teves. Will you remember tiny Karen Teves up here talking to you about the loss of her firstborn son? Or is it the story that they didn't know until his death that he had sat every day with a kid hurt in a car accident for 2 months? John Larimer, youngest of 5, the one that got all the attention from Mom. We remember his interest in serving, his big dreams of being president. Or will you remember that he was the kind of man that inspired his friends, at risk to themselves, to try to drag his lifeless body out of that theater rather than leave him behind? Jesse Childress, world traveler, son to a beloved mother. Or is it that he loved the Broncos so much he subsisted on ramen to be able to afford those season tickets? Michaela Medic, the sister that is no more. Will you remember what her older sister said up here? Or is what sticks out in your mind about the nature of the murder he perpetrated, that it was just a cruel twist of fate, that had she stayed in those awful seats that her friends had found, she might be here today. But she thought she'd found with her friend 2 better seats. And he shot her in the head. Matt McQuinn, is it that he was a hard-working Target employee who couldn't find enough employment to keep him from going home to Ohio? Or is it that Mr. Wonderful is buried now? Or maybe you'll remember that he had more bullet holes in him. He shot him more than any other person in that theater. And Veronica Mosier Sullivan. Forever 6. Never made it to first grade. And a mother who sat here to tell you that she's lost. She doesn't know who she is anymore. That she used to be a mother when she was 18. Now she's not anymore. 4 times. He shot her 4 times. Remember, too, in determining what is the appropriate sentence for what he did, that he came there for them all. The 700 rounds, the grave risk of death, and it wasn't sufficient to come prepared to shoot and to kill them, but to deprive them of the first responders that might have shown up to stop him or render aid. That moment, that picture's way too lit, but that moment when he stepped in with that tear gas and that gas mask, that 12-gauge shotgun, the 100-round drum clip in his assault rifle, the 40-round magazines on his person, and he stops pulling the trigger only because the trigger stopped working. Does that get a life sentence for that conduct? Remember, too, that he predicted a life sentence. Remember?
I'm going to object to speculation, a statement of the evidence.
Overruled.
Before he goes out to murder, he changes 2 of those social websites, Match.com. Will you visit me in prison? And more than predict it, he planned for it. Head to toe, fingers included. There wasn't a millimeter of flesh exposed to any possible pain or injury. He made sure that on July 20th, 1 person and 1 person alone would be guaranteed to survive. And that was him. For this. He predicted it. He planned for it. He wants it. Does this and everything else warrant a life sentence? That's not justice. That's not a reasoned moral determination. On July 20th, 2012, he came into that theater to perpetrate a mass murder. And we were lucky. The tear gas canister he fumbled, the apartment that didn't explode, the weapon that jammed, the hero first responders. They kept these 12 pictures from becoming hundreds of pictures. You remember, thank you, you remember that moment.
Hello, 911, where's your emergency? I can't hear you. What address? Theater over Colorado. Okay, yeah, so I can't hear you. Give me the address again. There's gunshot. What address? Say it loud.
You can't get justice for them. They are beyond the reach of this court and the law. And so you should not go back there and think about how to get justice for them. But we can appreciate the gravity of the crime that took them from us and treat it appropriately. You cannot get justice for them, those that came here to tell you how they have become part of the living dead, where parts of their lives are forever gone. That the silver lining to getting up every day is that it is one day closer to being reunited with their loved ones. You cannot get them justice, and you should not seek it. Bless you. But you can bring justice to this act and to him. And for James Egan Holmes, justice is death. It's death.
Thank you, Mr. Bruckler. Ms. Brady?
I will tell you one thing that Mr. Bruckler is right about, and that is that I am going to be emotional and I am going to be passionate. Because the weight of a man's life is in my hands right now until I hand it over to you. And you know what it feels like to have the weight of someone's life in your hands. And that is a passionate and emotional thing, and I will not apologize to you for standing here and being emotional and passionate. I will not. There's one decision left to be made. You all came here in January on your jury summons, and it's now August. And there is one final decision left to be made, and that is life or death. And that is not something to be taken lightly. The law breaks this sentencing up into 3 phases because they want you in phase 1 to think about the aggravation, to think about the crime. And that is about the crime. And they have phase 2, which is mitigation, because they want you to think about the background and character and mental illness. Phase 2 is about Mr. Holmes. But when you get to phase 3, when you get to the individual moral determination, that, folks, becomes about you. What do you do? What is in your heart and your soul and your mind? And the question presented at this phase 3 is no longer a comparative question. It is no longer a balancing like you did in phase 2 when you balanced mitigation and aggravation. The question in phase 3 is not comparative. It is final and it is an absolute question. Does James Holmes suffer the most harsh and severe punishment that our country, that our state allows? Execution? Or does he spend the rest of his life in prison without parole? Before I go on anymore, I want to acknowledge and I want to pay respects to the victims in that theater, both the ones who died and the ones who were injured, and everyone in that theater, and to their family members who came here and testified this week. This week's testimony was very hard to hear. The people who died in that theater were loved so intensely by the people who came in and testified. That was so clear. And our hearts, all of our hearts break at the loss of their loved ones. And it hurts us to watch their family and friends hurt. For we are all human in this room. And we all have people we love in our lives. And no matter how hard we try, we can't avoid imagining what it must be like to be in their shoes. And it breaks our heart. It's impossible not to feel the emotion and the passion and often the anger that comes with hearing this type of testimony. The people in that theater did not deserve to die that way. They should not have died that way. They were just some people out on a summer night to see the new Batman movie. That's it. But now what? Now what? No one at this table has spent a minute trying to convince you that James Holmes did not do that shooting in the theater. And no one at this table for a minute has tried to say that the people who were in that theater were anything other than blameless, innocent people out to watch a movie. But the point of disagreement in this trial is the same today as it was on day one: mental illness. And whether execution is the proper response when mental illness overtakes a young man and tragedy results. By this point, you either believe he is mentally ill or you don't. And that is different from saying whether he is sane or insane, and you know that all too well. But at this point, you either believe he's mentally ill or you don't. How many doctors should we bring in to tell you that he's seriously mentally ill? How many doctors from how far across the United States, in how many different specialties do we need to bring you to convince you that he's seriously mentally ill? 2, 5, 10? Because you've heard from Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein from the university, and they saw Mr. Holmes before July 20th. They saw him from March to June of 2012. And they told you that they were worried he was on the verge of a psychotic break. And they wanted to give him antipsychotics because they were worried that he was becoming psychotic. You heard testimony from Dr. Woodcock, who, yes, the defense contacted and asked to go in within days of the shooting. And he told you that in his opinion, Mr. Holmes suffered from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder and that he was psychotic. Dr. Gurr, with all of her expertise and training and background and experience in schizophrenia testified that she thought he is schizophrenic, psychotic, and that but for that illness, the shooting would never have occurred. Dr. Hanlon did the neuropsychological testing and told you that all of the results of all of the instruments he did were consistent with someone suffering from schizophrenia, consistent with someone who was psychotic. And the doctors that the judge appointed through the Colorado Mental Health Institute in Pueblo, Dr. Reed from Texas, Dr. Metzner from here in Colorado, you heard from him twice. And they came in and told you that it is their expert opinion that he suffers from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder, that he is psychotic, and that he is seriously mentally ill. And but for that mental illness, this never would have occurred. And the doctors from the state hospital and the doctors from Denver Health and all of the doctors who saw him wherever it was and whenever it was, all unanimously agreed that he is seriously mentally ill. And so if at this point you do not believe he's mentally ill, then you have chosen to ignore that mound of evidence that proves he was. And efforts have been made to mock and demean and deny that he is mentally ill, to make him out to seem hateful and evil and selfish, because you have to dehumanize someone before you can ask other people to kill him. It is easier to ask you to kill a monster than it is a sick human being. It is medieval to claim that schizophrenia is the source of evil, and that demeans all people who suffer from mental illness, and it demeans us all. And if you do at this point believe that he's mentally ill, if you do believe that mound of uncontested evidence of mental illness, if you do believe that, then the time has come to ask yourself, do I sign my name on the death warrant of a mentally ill person? Death is not a punishment for mental illness, and death is not a cure or a solution for mental illness, and the death of a seriously mentally ill man is not justice, no matter how tragic the case is. The death penalty will not make mental illness go away. And although not all people who have psychosis commit tragic crimes and take innocent lives, when the disease consumes and controls a person in the way it did with Mr. Holmes, the results are often what we see here. Each of us has to honestly say to ourselves, there but for the grace of God go I, or go my child. Why did he get schizophrenia? Why didn't I get schizophrenia? Why don't you have schizophrenia? Is it because he was born with the genetics predetermined for him to get schizophrenia? Was it because he inherited it from the people who came before him in his family? Is it because it strikes like lightning, or it's like getting a cancer, it's just a random occurrence that he got it and I didn't and you didn't? And if you would not wish schizophrenia on your worst enemy, then what logic dictates that the son of Bob and Arlene Holmes should suffer execution for it? There are things in addition to mental illness that should lead you to conclude that a life sentence is appropriate in this case. For the 24 to 25 years prior to July 20th, James Holmes had absolutely no criminal history at all. He never broke the law but for a couple traffic tickets. He never broke the law. He never broke rules. He never was even disrespectful or rude. He lived 24 to 25 years in complete compliance with all of the rules and all of the laws of all of us, until out of the blue the mental illness struck, and all of a sudden he has red hair and stuff in his apartment, and he's buying all this stuff, and he's planning this mission because of the mental illness. But you can appreciate that prior to that, he had never hurt anyone. He had never broken the law. He is not someone who has spent his life hurting people or getting in trouble. Or you can appreciate the upbringing that he had from Bob and Arlene Holmes, and how they raised him, and what kind of son they raised prior to the time the illness struck. And those are also reasons to consider a life sentence for him. You, jurors, were chosen for this case because you told us that the enormity and the magnitude of this case would not automatically draw the death penalty for you. And you were chosen for this case because you said that you would give meaningful consideration to the mitigation, especially mental health mitigation. That you would meaningfully consider that as a reason for a life sentence. And you were chosen for this case because you all said that, yes, I will listen to and respect victim impact evidence, but that will not be the driving force. It will be a consideration, but not the driving force of my sentencing decision in this case. And it is very natural when we hear evidence like that, testimony like that, to feel anger and emotion and passion. But what the law asks you to do, and what we ask you to do, is to not make that decision when you're in an emotional state. How many times in our lives do we make decisions rashly when we're angry or emotional, and we look back and think, oh, I shouldn't have done that? How many times do we hesitate before we hit send on an email because we want to make sure we're not overreacting to something? We want to take a step aside. We want to sleep on it for a while. Let me think about that for a while, because we've learned not to make decisions in an emotional state. And what we ask you to do in this case is to take a step aside, the emotion and the passion, to sleep on it, to think about it, to rise above all of this tragedy so that you have some perspective in making this decision. For this will be the most important decision you may ever make in your life. And it needs to be one that you can live with. Right now, you have the opportunity to be the example of anger without vengeance, sadness without hate, justice without violence. And you have the opportunity right now to give accountability with mercy, compassion with understanding, and resolution with no more death. For the death penalty does not bring anyone back. It doesn't make anyone feel better. It just adds to the death count. Once you make this decision, you can't come back on some other day and say that you've changed your mind. You can't come back later and say, I've given this some more thought and I've changed my mind. Now is the only chance, and now is the final chance. And when it's all said and done, you go home only with yourself. When you wake up in the middle of the night and you think about this case, it's just you, and you answer only to you. And when you look yourself in the mirror in the morning and you think about this case, it's just you, and you just answer to you. For we will not be there, and they will not be there. It is just you, and you answer only to your own conscience. And don't make this decision out of concern for what the community or other people are going to think about you. Because you know that you need to do what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular. And if a life sentence is something that's right for you, and you need to do what's right. What will you think about your decision 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What do you want to tell your children and your grandchildren about this moment? And I am going to talk to you about mercy because the judge read you an instruction that says you may consider mercy for Mr. Holmes in determining what the appropriate sentence is. The measure of our soul is in how we treat people who are sick and who are damaged. And James Holmes is sick and he is damaged. And if you choose to grant mercy, to bestow mercy on James Holmes, it's not because he earned it. It's not because he deserves it. For mercy is not something that's earned or deserved. It's something that is bestowed by the person who gives it. Mercy says more about you than it says about him. What you do here says more about you if you choose to exercise mercy, not about him. It is something you choose to do, what you do in this moment. Justice without mercy is raw vengeance. Mercy is what makes us civilized. And mercy is what puts an end to violence. And just as James Holmes did not ask to have a mental illness, neither did his parents ask to have a son with mental illness. And Bob and Arlene Holmes have been here during this trial every day to love and support their son. And that they will always love and support their son for the rest of his life. And they know that he is sick, and they know that he would not have committed this unthinkable, tragic occurrence had he not been sick. But he is, and he is their son, and he is still Chrissy's brother, and his life has meaning to them. There was a time when our country would execute children for crimes they committed, and that is no longer done because we...
Yes. objection is sustained.
There is not now, nor will there ever be, a time when it is appropriate to execute a seriously mentally ill man. For we need to open our eyes to the effects of mental illness. And it will not go away just because we don't like it and just because we try and get rid of it. Justice. Justice requires that each of you be just in your own mind and in your own heart. And justice cannot be for one side alone. There has to be justice for all. And there is justice in mercy. And we ask that you accept the truth that all of us as human beings are all more and better than our own worst deeds. And that our peace and humanity abide not in our capacity for fear and hatred and revenge, but it resides in our capacity to be compassionate and understanding and merciful. Before, during, and after July 20th of 2012, he was seriously mentally ill, and this tragedy was born of disease, not of choice. And we do not execute someone for getting sick. The law never requires a death sentence. Not in this case, not in any case, not in the worst case you can imagine. Because the law tells you that this is a moral decision. And only you can decide what is right for you morally. Other moral decisions we make in our lives, what religion to practice, if to have a religion at all, whom to marry, how to raise our children. And no one can rightly tell you that your moral decisions in those areas are wrong. That would not be right. And just like that, no one can tell you what is right for you. Not the prosecution, not the defense. That is up to you, because it's your individual moral determination. This is your moral assessment. And the law says that only if all 12 of you think that death is the only appropriate sentence will it be the death penalty. And it will be the death penalty if it's all 12. But if even one of you thinks that a life sentence is appropriate, or that you don't want to sign your name to a death sentence, if only one of you, then the law says it will be a life sentence. Because the law does not want to put any one person in the position of being responsible for the death of someone that is not that person's choice. Life without parole in prison is a very severe and harsh sentence. To spend the rest of your life in a cell, alone, especially when you're as sick as Mr. Holmes is, that is a severe punishment. He will be punished one way or the other. And his mental illness does not shield him from punishment. Nothing at this point can shield him from punishment. He will be punished. And the mental illness we presented to you is to have you assess his moral culpability. And you might ask, who could be more morally culpable? Who could be more culpable? Maybe someone who committed this crime who was not mentally ill. Maybe someone who committed this kind of crime for fun or for pleasure or for no reason at all. But that is not James Holmes. James Holmes committed this crime because he was psychotic and delusional. And that is what makes him less morally culpable. And he tried to get help. It was unsuccessful, but he tried to get help. When he went to see Dr. Fenton, it was his soul screaming for help while his mind was drowning in illness. but he tried. He knew he was losing control, and he tried. And we're not blaming anyone at CU or blaming the school or the hospital. This evidence was presented to you so that you would know the whole truth of what happened to James Holmes in the spring of 2012. This is a moral decision that you're being asked to make. And morals are so personal. Groups don't make morals, individuals do. And as soon as you have decided that for you, you need to stand up for what you believe is right because someone's life is in the balance. And once you make the decision that a life sentence would be appropriate for James Holmes, once you have given that calm reflection and thought about everything that has been presented and listened to everything that your other jurors may have wanted to share with you, after you have done all that and you are certain in your heart that a life sentence will be appropriate in this case, I want you to tell the foreman that you've made your decision. And again, he might agree with you, or he might feel differently, but he will respect your decision, and he will bring that decision back into this courtroom. The deaths of all of those people cannot be answered by another death. Please, no more death. He will be punished. He will be punished severely, and he will be punished for the rest of his life.
Thank you, Ms. Brady. Would counsel please approach? Mr. Brockler, is there a rebuttal closing argument at this time on behalf of the prosecution?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Members of the jury, because there is no more rebuttal, that means we've come to the end of the proceedings, and the only thing that's left is your deliberations. So let me give you a few final instructions. Before I do that, though, I want to follow up on an objection that was made earlier that I overruled, and I gave you a summarized version off the top of my head of a portion of one of the instructions that you have with you. And so let me read for you. This is from instruction number 4, and it is as follows. Even if you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the mitigating factors that exist do not outweigh the proven aggravating factors, you must still individually make a profoundly moral assessment or evaluation of the defendant's character and his crimes of murder in the first degree in order to determine whether or not you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that death is the appropriate sentence. Phase 3 is separate and distinct from Phase 2. I'm not emphasizing this instruction over the others. You have to consider all of the instructions as a whole. I'm simply following up because there was an objection that I overruled, and I want to make sure that you're clear that your decisions in these proceedings before today do not govern or dictate what decisions you make now. Does that make sense? Everybody understand that? And everyone's nodding their head yes. Okay, great. Thank you. You're familiar now with the drill when it comes to deliberations, but I'm going to go over a few things with you just in case. First of all, only the 12 of you who are deliberating jurors will deliberate, and you will deliberate in the jury room here behind courtroom 201, the 201 jury room. Those of you who are alternates will be kept separate and will not have any contact with the deliberating jurors. Those of you who are alternates are not allowed to start forming opinions or to think about the case or to deliberate in any way. And all of the advisements that I have been giving you throughout the trial apply to the alternates. Those of you who are alternates should not be looking at the instructions or the verdict forms or anything like that. You can talk about other things with one another, but nothing related to the case or related to your juror service. There are no limits on the time that deliberations take. They can take as little or as long as the deliberating jurors decide. In terms of scheduling, you're on your own. I know that in the past you've said your deliberations will be from 8:30 to 4:30, and we will proceed with that understanding. If you change your mind at some point, just let us know so that we can coordinate with the alternates. We will send back to the jury room the original instructions and the original verdict forms. Additionally, we will send back to the jury room the exhibits that have been admitted, all of the exhibits that have been admitted with the exception of live ammunition. And again, you know the rule. If you want the live ammunition, we'll take back the firearms from you and give you the live ammunition. Please do not consult any previous instructions that I have given you. I know that I gave you some instructions at the end of the trial, and you deliberated at that point. I gave you some instructions at the end of phase 1, and you deliberated at that point. And I gave you some instructions at the end of phase 2, and you deliberated at that point. Do not go back and read those prior instructions or consult those instructions. The instructions that I'm giving you now are the instructions in their entirety. Those are the ones that you should rely on. Does everyone understand all of that? And then finally, just a reminder that there will be a 3-hour delay between the time when you deliberating jurors communicate to my bailiffs that you have completed the final sentencing verdict forms, and the time when I bring you into the courtroom and I announce the contents of those sentencing verdict forms. All right, so please plan accordingly. All right, folks, with that, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to retire to the jury room. Those of you who are deliberating can start deliberating. The rest of you who are alternates, will put you in a separate room. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect the jury has exited the courtroom. Let me supplement the record with respect to my ruling and the objection by the defense to Mr. Brockler's use of the word evil to describe some of the defendant's acts, but not the defendant. This is from People versus Nicholas, 842 Northeastern 2nd, 674, a case from 2005. This is a case from Illinois, and it was modified on denial of rehearing on January 23, 2006. The court spoke as follows: a closing argument must serve a purpose beyond inflaming the emotions of the jury. We recently re-emphasized that a prosecutor may not characterize the defendant as an evil person or cast the jury's decision as a choice between good and evil. But a prosecutor may comment unfavorably on the evil effects of the crime and urge the jury to administer the law without fear when such argument is based upon competent and pertinent evidence. Pure evil, as used by the prosecutor here, refer to specific actions by the defendant. getting his gun, hunting his mother in the street, pointing the gun at her, shooting her 4 times, stashing his gun, returning to bed, and displaying little concern about her death. The prosecutor characterized the defendant's actions as pure evil in order to preface his argument that the facts prove the defendant guilty. The prosecutor's remarks constituted a permissible comment upon the evidence. I found another case. This is State versus McFadden, 391 Southwestern 3rd, 408. This is a case from the Missouri Supreme Court from 2013, and this is actually a death penalty case, and it relates to the prosecutor's closing argument during the penalty phase of the case. The court spoke as follows. The defendant asserts that the prosecutor improperly referred to him as an evil person while referring to the victim as a good person. I believe it was the victim. A prosecutor is free to characterize a defendant's criminal conduct if the evidence supports such a characterization. The evidence in this case supports the prosecutor's characterization. The argument was not improper, because in this case, Mr. Bruckler's comments were not referring to the defendant as being an evil person, but were referring to the defendant's acts as being evil acts. And because that argument was based on the evidence, I overruled the objection, and I stand by that ruling, but I wanted to supplement the record. Is there anything else at this time on behalf of the people that we need to talk about? Mr. Bruckler?
No, sir. Thank you.
Is there anything else on behalf of the defense?
No, thank you.
All right, we'll call you if we have any questions or any requests, or if the jury notifies us that they have completed the sentencing verdict forms. All right, the court will be in recess. Thank you, everyone.
Do you need us to stay in the building, or can we go?
Same rules as before, within about 15 minutes.